Many of the earliest games function on a concept of turns. You take your turn, I take mine, and we go back and forth until someone meets the conditions needed to win. This rings true for most board games, some of the most successful sports in the world, and even video games. The concept of turns is widely understood between those who have played pretty much any kind of game, and I don't think you need me to explain it to you. But I want to talk about something that's a bit more fluid. For lots of sports, turns can be divided into offense or defense, or by possession of the ball, considering whoever's turn it is, they're in position to score a point. But for fighting games, the concept of turns is a bit different. What do we actually mean when we say it's someone's turn? Is it frame advantage? When I'm plus on block, is it now my turn? Well, not exactly. What about a neutral? Whose turn is it there? Realistically, it's either both of our turns or neither of our turns, which doesn't really make sense. Fighting games are great in this way, in that it's so fluid that there's no way to define a lot of moments in the sense of traditional games or sports.
Not enough to kill. Oh, he's got him again! Three for three! He's got him! Kuokin takes Tokido to loser's bracket with 3 wake-up critical arts back to back to back.
But what would it be like if we tried to make that happen? How would a fighting game with turns actually work? What would that look like? Fighting game visionary Yoshinori Ono sought to answer this question way back in the early 2010s. After the massive success that was Street Fighter II and the misguided flop that was Street Fighter III, Capcom struggled to be convinced that Street Fighter IV needed to happen, let alone more fighting games in general.
Was it hard to convince Capcom to bring Street Fighter back?
It was really, really difficult. Yeah. Capcom as a company, to be honest, at that point had kind of got to the point in time where they were past making fighting games in general for a while, let alone just Street Fighter. I think it was 99.99% decided that, fighting games were done and dusted and we were moving on to other things.
When asked why he thought fighting games went away for so long, Ono had this to say.
Looking back, I think that one of the main reasons was fighting games have always been popular, there's been a big audience for them, but it's always been a mixture of more casual players who like to jump in and try the game out and have fun, and then you have your really up to your professional level of fighting game fanatics who really dig deep in the systems, and I think that the gap between the larger audience and then the very specific core audience just got bigger and bigger, to the point where after Street Fighter 3 Third Strike, it was just, we'd almost brought it to the furthest place we could.
Because of people's ability to dive deeper and deeper into the mechanic of games like Third Strike, the gap between casuals and hardcore players grew to a point where they weren't even sure which part of the fan base was really being serviced. So from there, they were forced with a decision: cater to casuals or cater to hardcore fans. Ono strived to make sure he did both with Street Fighter IV. His approach was to open the doors to people and allow them to mess with the mechanics at an earlier point, and if they decide to proceed further into the weeds of it, the game should allow that and encourage limitless exploration. Such an approach was somewhat radical at the time, but it's what led to the revitalization of fighting games around the world. It's funny to think that Ono had even more radical ideas in the works.
I did have an idea that I thought was revolutionary, to turn it more into a turn-based simulation. So you would take the moves you want to do and you'd put them together like blocks, and then they would run automatically, but obviously we didn't make that in the end.
A turn-based simulated fighting game sounded silly during the time of this interview, and honestly, hearing it the way he explains it now, it doesn't really sound viable.
Boring!
Come on, you schnorrers! Do something!
But what if I were to tell you that this game does exist, and it exists in a few forms? Interestingly enough, there's multiple board games that attempted to replicate the fast-paced action of a fighting game, and some actually have pretty much nailed it. Games like Combo Fighter and YOMI come to mind immediately when I imagine a turn-based kind of fighting game. We'll focus on YOMI for this video, as the game does have a video game version as well as an adaptation into a traditional fighter with the same characters called Fantasy Strike, which is definitely worth a try if you haven't played it yet. YOMI takes a very traditional card game approach in that your moves are, well, literal cards, but it obviously goes deeper than that. there's tons of different cards that interact with each other in wild ways. For example, projectile cards have certain properties like recurring and lockdown, which interact with certain defensive options. If a projectile is blocked, that opponent isn't going to be able to draw a card, which blocking usually grants. If they dodge the projectile, they're not rewarded with a free punish either. On top of these interactions, there's a literal Fire Emblem weapon triangle, a rock, paper, scissors system usually seen in fighting games, like strikes beat throws, throws beat dodges, and dodges beat strikes. There's actually a ton more to this game, like combos building super meter, but my favorite thing has to be how they handled character archetypes. Normally, I would imagine character archetypes of a fighting game requiring a lot of movement and dynamic action, but YOMI actually gets it right. This means if you have a certain archetype you like to play in a game, you can have that for your main. For example, Valerie has certain moves that are plus on block or on hit, as well as high-level projectile that grants her mix-up, making the opponent backpedal on defense. Rook's got super armor, which means that he wins against strikes that are normally faster, and his throws are exceptionally quick. He plays like a grappler, only needing a few hits before the opponent kinda just disintegrates. Now, while I do think this game is super fun to play with friends, I wouldn't really call it a turn-based fighting game. It's a fighting card game, and for what it's worth, I'd say those are starkly different as the turns in this game happen arbitrarily, and some of the mix from them is pretty much unfair at times. But a true turn-based fighting game would probably look something more freeform, and have actual fighting game mechanics instead of just cards depicting said interactions. The perfect example encompassing all of that to me is Bad Res Games' upcoming Checkmate Showdown. As you can probably tell just from looking at it, Checkmate Showdown infuses fighting games with the elements of, well, yeah, chess. At its core, CS is a tag team fighter with interesting strategical elements put in place. Pieces can move around the board as they do in chess, but their placements carry heavy significance on the fighting gameplay, more so than the chess part. As an example, you can only have access to certain assists as long as the pieces are within ranges of each other. You also have to manage your character's health bars, as certain pieces can come in and attack you just to wipe a certain piece off the board. To me, this is an incredible spin on a fighting game, as I've never really seen anything like this. My biggest issue with team fighter games is that counterpicks often feel really stagnated. In Ultimate Marvel vs. Capcom 3, we've seen certain teams rise to the top of the meta and look nearly undefeatable, leading to mirror matches in games with some of the most expressive potential out there. Or in games like King of Fighters, where there are plenty of counterpicks available, which you'd hope would lead to diverse teams. Instead, people just tend to pick the characters that are good overall, leaving certain characters to literally never get used in a bracket. Checkmate Showdown seems to do away with this, giving each player the same team of 5 characters, but instead putting the focus on how they maneuver and strategize with said team. Players can still decide to main certain pieces, but even in a match, it's likely they'll have to use each character at some point. Personally, I see a lot of potential with a game like this. As a starting point, chess makes sense, but this could easily expand into its own genre if enough thought went into it. I'm excited to see more from Bad Res in the future, and hope this game turns out as hype as its potential can allow. But even with a game like Checkmate Showdown, I don't think it's quite the sweet spot that Ono was talking about in his interview. We're looking for a game that would run like a fighting game simulator. It wouldn't ask as much from the player as Checkmate Showdown, but it would still be simple. There is one game I've heard of, though, that could fit this mold, and just looking at it, it doesn't really look simple. Your Only Move is Hustle is a real-time turn-based strategy game in which certain moves are simulated between opponents. Characters have unique movesets and techniques that stack on top of each other in unique ways. The opening gambit is about predicting what your opponent will do and trying to get that first hit, which is kind of the same as every other fighting game. But will your opponent block? Will they do a slow advancing armored move? Are any others of the hundreds of options available to them? And I do mean hundreds because there's modded community characters and moveset randomizers. Once you do land a hit, combos are pretty much freeform, but difficult to optimize as every move has different properties and can move your character around the screen in unpredictable ways if you haven't labbed the follow-ups out. Which is kind of awesome because I love that you have to lab in this turn-based fighting game. The defensive side of things is no joke either. For players getting hit, there's something called DI. No, not that DI. This one stands for Directional Influence. It's a mechanic popularized by the Smash Bros. Game, in which a player getting hit can input a direction that will affect the way they get knocked back from said combo. With good DI, you can escape the opponent's strings faster, taking less damage, and sometimes even dodging an attack completely to launch your own offense. In this sense, both defense and offense are active endeavors that encourage players to always be engaged, no matter what phase of the game they're in. This is something that even regular fighting games with long combos struggle with, so it makes me extremely happy to see that implemented here. I honestly do not have much more to say about Your Only Move is Hustle, or maybe I have too much to say for this video? It's a simple premise, extremely so, but it has so much depth when you really dig around in it. Literally anyone can pick up and play this game, and there's so much to discover between all the community characters, moves, and funny interactions. Plus, it's only like $5 on Steam, so seriously, go play this game. To close this one out, to me, it's just funny to look back at what Ono was thinking all those years ago. He wanted to create something new and innovative for fighting games, but the world just wasn't ready for his vision. That's not to say his idea would have been good, because he was infamous for having bad ideas among his good ones, but here we are a full decade and a half after Street Fighter 4, and major fighting games kinda look the same? I'm not here to say if that's good or bad, but it feels like we haven't had a major game changer to the genre in a while. Fighting games open up the space to be so incredibly varied, but when was the last time we really saw a concept that blew us away? Tag fighters have been around for a while, and yeah, they're incredibly fun, it's just not a new concept by any means. The same can be said about team fighters, footsie-based games, 3D fighters, air dashers, and whatever else. Platform fighters are still chasing the high from a game that came out 20 years ago. Now please don't misunderstand what I mean when I say this, as it's not a bad thing that we found ideas that work, but what I'm most excited for is finding more of those ideas and seeing how they interact with what's already been established. Games like Checkmate Showdown and YOMI Hustle are exactly what I think developers need to be doing with fighting games, and I can't wait to see where turn-based fighters end up next. That's all I've got for now. I hope you enjoyed. See you in the next one.